Our ship was a big target to the Japanese, but that didn't help them much because we had these enormous anti-aircraft batteries. I was only with Admiral Halsey for a couple of months when I shot down a Japanese plane. It was luck. I could have waited weeks and weeks and weeks before that happened, but I just was lucky. Admiral Halsey sent me a written citation, which I proceeded to forward to my father. He couldn't believe it. He just couldn't believe it. It didn't seem to him possible.
I was shooting bazookas, and I lost my hearing for a while. I had an ear that rings. I was on sick call many times, and there was not much they could do at the time. At that time, we didn't have earplugs. We didn't have earmuffs. We had cotton, and the cotton would fall out during the day. But it was good training. I'm not sorry.
I went back to my company, and my company commander asked if I got my guitar, and I told him what had happened. Well, next morning we fell out for reveille. He announced to all the troops from the company there, who would like to have a goddamn good rough-and-tumble fight, if necessary. Nobody raised their hands because you didn't volunteer for anything like that. But he said, "Let me tell you the reason why. That guitar and Stewart Barr has built the morale in this company as long as we've been in here, and I think we should go over there and get it." Then everybody raised their hands. We all marched over, and the company had moved out, and that was the end of my guitar story. But then my own company went and got me another one, so we continued on with our music.
The 1st of November, they shipped us overseas to the European theater, and we went over on the Aquitania, which avoided the subs by changing direction every 5 minutes. We zigzagged across the Atlantic. They were sending us up to Holland. In December of 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge started, they just stopped us and sent us into the battle lines with the Battle of the Bulge. I was still in the company headquarters division, which is usually about a mile and a half behind the lines. It's a good place to be because you stand a good chance of being alive at the end of the war. By that time, I'd worked my way up from supply division over to the post office, so I was doing a job that a master sergeant would normally do, but I was a PFC, and they needed somebody to fill the spot. That's where I stayed the rest of the war, sorting mail. One of my jobs as a company clerk on Okinawa was to write letters of condolence. Like everything else, the Army had a form for it, but I was able to embellish it. Quite often people would die in a very mundane activity, but I made them all heroes, which they were just for being there. I made sure that what little solace their parents could get out of it, I think I made sure that they felt, if you can feel good about your child dying, why, they did.
Keith was killed when they were going on to the island. His buddy that was going on to the island with him was badly injured, and he wrote us a letter saying that Keith was killed instantly. He never knew what hit him. It was very bad for my mother because he was the son that stayed at home and did things for them, took care of her and helped with the other children. It was like a big hole in the family.
On May 30th, I was sent on to pick up a wounded British officer. The minesweepers had not covered the road, although everyone thought they had. I had a co-driver always with me, and in the back of the ambulance we had a British medical officer and an Italian guide. We were blown up by a mine before we could get the wounded officer. Even though the ambulance was completely destroyed, the British medical officer was somehow not hurt. The Italian guide was killed instantly. My co-driver was gravely wounded and died later in a hospital. I was badly burned, but able to crawl out through the windshield. I had lost everything. My clothes were burned from my entire body, as were my dog tags. The only thing I had on were my boots and my watch, and the watch was still going. We went out there, and all of a sudden mortar fire started dropping on us. Machine guns started up, and rifle fire. We knew we were in the wrong place because we were out in the open, so we just tried to get back to the main part of the company. I, myself, ended up on the side of the road away from where I should have been because there was a ditch there, deep enough so I could get out of the line of fire. I had a very good friend in the company from New Hampshire. He yelled at me and said, "I'm going to fire, and while I'm covering you, and you get back over here, just run across the road." So I did. It was the first day. Anyway, we did survive, most of us, and we grew.
While I was in basic training, they checked my background and found I had been a teacher. There were several others of us in the same unit, and they picked out 3 of us and sent us to Fort Sam Houston in Texas. We were to set up a school to give people who couldn't read the equivalent of a third-grade education in 13 weeks with no books.
They sent me down to St. Simons, Georgia, to fighter director school. This is where you control aircraft for intercepts. I spent 3 months down there and was qualified as a fighter director. I used to go on carriers to practice when we were at sea. It was at St. Simons I decided then that I certainly liked what I was doing, and I applied for the regular Navy.
I remember going through a small German village called Bergdorf. As we entered the village, all the local children came out on the side of the road and were asking for chocolate, chocolate, chocolate. We all reached into our pockets and handed out candy bars that we had. It was probably 40-odd years later that I learned that I had entered the village of Bergdorf and a local resident here in Woodstock lived there, Marguerite Pierce. She explained to me that she was on the side of the road asking American soldiers for chocolate. I may have handed Marguerite a chocolate. We've been good friends ever since. It was one of those experiences in life. I was glad that I went. I was glad to be home, and I don't care if I have to go again. I'd rather go than have one of my sons or one of my grandsons, or now great-grandsons, have to go in the service. I'd go again. I figured that it was good training, and I've had times in life that things seemed a little tough. And I've just taken a deep breath and said, well, you know, you trained to be a Marine. You can handle that. It works for me. Semper Fi.
We never had any daylight air raid until April of 1943. I was always apprehensive because I figured sooner or later there was going to be one. Well, on this morning, 100 of their aircraft came over. Probably a third of them were bombers. The rest probably were fighters for protection, and they were all strung out right across the sky. As it turned out, a couple of U.S. fighter pilots had flown up above them and dove down into their formation and shot a few of them and went right down through them. It caused them to panic and break away, so whatever bombs they dropped really didn't do much of any damage in the airfield area and didn't hurt us in any way.
One reason I decided to join the service was because my brother was drafted. He had 2 small children, and I felt if they were that hard up, maybe I should join the service. I first applied to the Navy, but I didn't hear from them for quite a while, so I contacted the Marines. They came to see me, but they said they didn't compete with the Navy. When I was finally accepted by the Navy, I felt really proud that I was going on active duty. I thought I was doing a little thing to help the war effort.
This is some Japanese money I took off a body, along with a letter from a guy. He was a soldier. He was probably writing his wife or something. So, after I came back, I got this woman I was taking to Boston. I told her I had a letter from this Japanese guy for his wife. She said she'd like to take it because she was going to Japan and teach. But I never did get it to her in time. That would have been good, you know. Maybe she could have found the person it belonged to.
The war changed me. It gave me a lot more self-confidence. I treasure the time that I spent there, but I would never want to do it again if I didn't have to. I'd spent so much time in the service going to school, I just did not have any desire to continue after the war, and I wanted to stay in Woodstock. You asked me what I miss most? It was Woodstock.
After basic training, I applied for ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program, where you go back to college. Of course, I worked on the firing line all day and had to take the test at night after that. So I thought I did pretty well on English. Calculus, I didn't do anything. I just checked. It was a multiple choice, and I went through them and checked the ones I thought were right. I didn't give a damn anyway. It turned out I pretty near flunked English, but I did a pretty near perfect job in calculus. So they sent me along to Rutgers in New Jersey.
I joined the Vermont State Guard as a junior in high school in June 1944. We would train upstairs in the town hall. There's a large room up there, and we'd do close order drills in the winter. If you didn't turn when your command came, you'd end up on the stage or in the wall. When I went to Europe, I was assigned first to learn the rebuilding of truck engines. There were piles, scraps of used engines as high as the house. The size of the military was so impressive, I was in just one depot. I remember seeing howitzers lined up in a field by the acre, hundreds and hundreds of just that one piece of equipment.
I was assigned to work as a medical technician in a dispensary where the soldiers go on sick call. Right next door to us was the place where they gave shots. Sometimes people would get really upset about these shots and worry about them. Sometimes one would fall over and it was like dominoes. There'd be a whole group of them that would faint.
We had one thing going for us. We had a tremendously intelligent captain. His name was Merlin O'Neill, and he later became commander of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and admiral. He had a talent because a sub-pack come up and started firing torpedoes. The ships were anchored, and that way we were sitting ducks. He said, "Let the damned anchor go." He didn't worry because we could get rid of that anchor in the matter of a minute and a half, just letting it go down. It was a racket like you'd never heard of your life, and with that thing going down through the funnels, he had us underway in about 2.5 minutes. That probably saved our ship and everybody aboard it. But in the meantime, our boats were rendezvousing around us, picking up sailors and people that were unfortunate enough that they were torpedoed and their ships sunk.
We went on to Rhombus, France. We were there 6 weeks. We got to know a few of the people, and the people got friendly. I was ill for a while with the flu or something. One of the ladies sent over a bottle of white stuff. It was called Mirabelle, a wine, kind of like White Lightning. Of course, the guys wanted to keep me sick as long as I was getting that supply coming in. That town took an affection toward us for how we treated them and everything. And just last year, they built a memorial to our particular battery and battalion.
I did miss being home, and finally the day arrived when we got on the boat to head back to the United States. On the way back, there was a terrific storm that lasted several days. We were due back in 9 days. It took us 11. The waves were so high that the hatches were battened down, and the crew had to go with ropes around the deck. I thought, too bad to go through nearly 3 years on foreign soil and then go down with a boat on the way back home.
Beyond that point right there, the Rhine River was the city of Essen. That was like our Pittsburgh or whatever. They had steel mills. Krupp had all his stuff there. The Air Force had worked that over, and we were supposed to get them to surrender or something. My company commander and some others got to old man Krupp. He was alive and right there. By God, they went right to his door and beat on the door. Well, this doorman said Mr. Krupp wasn't available to see anybody right at the moment. The commander busted right through that door and said, "By God, we're going to see him right now." He took off right up the stairs, and they got him and took him prisoner. Well, he went through a court hearing. Of course, he was instrumental in running that whole show there. He was a good friend of Hitler's. I mean, you couldn't say that he shot so-and-so because he didn't actually pull the trigger, but he made the gun that did the job.
The United States Navy Construction Battalions, USNCB. The symbols were CBs. They had a uniform that had a B on it with all sorts of things in its hands that represented the CBs. The format now is very much like the Army Engineers, and they do similar kinds of work. It's now been formalized and has proper manuals, but when I first went into the service, it was a very informal organization. There were no particular procedures. If something had to be done, you were called upon to go do it without having to go through any particular format.
George Johnson tried to enlist in the Army a couple of months after the war started, but he was rejected for a heart murmur. In May 1942, by then he was 33 years old, he was drafted a week after getting married, and this time the heart murmur didn't matter. He was sent direct to boot camp at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The Army put up posters looking for volunteers to go into glider training. They didn't offer much information, other than an immediate promotion to sergeant and an increase in pay. He signed up. First off, the bombardier up in the nose was screaming, "Pull up! Pull up!" We could feel the plane brushing the treetops. I had my safety harness on and I was dying to bail out. After the crash, there were a lot of flames all around and the burning gas and all. The two gunners were yelling, "Get out! Get out!"
You wouldn't believe what happened in these dug-in caves where the enemy hid. A fellow by the name of Jackson and myself went caving. It was probably as far as from here to the jail underground, about 4 or 5 feet wide. You could walk and stand up in it. He had a pistol from the warrant officer. If you pulled it quick, it wouldn't fire. So we went into the cave, just like going down that alleyway there. We'd look in here and look in there, and here was silk stockings and money. We got about halfway down through it, and there was a place dug out and a cot in a space. He reached over with the pistol and rolled a blanket back, and a Japanese soldier sat up. He missed him, no farther than from me to you. Bang, the shot went right over him. And then he couldn't fire again because he had pulled it so fast. The gun was worn. But I'll tell you, I never forgot that. You'd have seen those 2 people travel from here to there to get out of there.
The message from our leaders or our officers was not to get out of your hole, because anybody that got out of their hole would be shot, because the enemy was all around us. We could hear them out in the back. They were drinking their sake, and we thought, well, any time they'd come charging through. It didn't happen that night to us, but we did have quite an unusual evening. As I laid up looking at the stars that night, all of a sudden I felt this sand on my face. I didn't know if it was coming from somebody walking around or what. Suddenly, my heart really pounded, and I thought somebody was going to be standing right over me. But what I saw above me was this huge land sea crab fall right in the middle of my stomach, and it scared the hell out of me. I just grabbed that big thing and threw it. And when I threw it into another guy's foxhole. At the time, we were all scared. We didn't know what was going on. Sure enough, the guy I threw it to, he threw it to someone else, and we started to laugh about it the next day. But it was not a very pleasant night.
My brother was a Navy pilot, and he was killed in the Coral Sea battle. Right across the street from the telephone company where I worked was a Navy recruiting office. I walked right over, and I told the woman there I was interested. But first, I wanted to go home where my parents were in Miami, and I wanted to be with them. So I went back to the telephone company, and they paid for my way and everything. They were wonderful to me. I told them I wouldn't be back until after the war.
In Colmar, France, we were putting on a demonstration one day with a greenhorn lieutenant, and he said the slit trench was much better than the foxhole. I said, "No, it ain't either. What the hell ails you?" "Well," he says, "we'll see." So they dug a slit trench, and he jumped in it, and they dug a foxhole, and somebody got in that. They had this big Sherman tank there, and say, "This is your trench." He run the track right over it, here like this, and says, "Turn," and they turned, and they buried that goddamn lieutenant right there. They had to dig him out. That was a slit trench. See, the dirt rolled right up there and filled that hole full. With the foxhole, you don't do that, because you can't see too much if you're going in a tank, because you got so much iron in front of you. But that tank buried him good. Boy, was that lieutenant mad. Well, I guess he was mad. We had to dig him out. We should have left him right in there, but we didn't.
It was while doing that on the morning of, what was it, the 6th or 7th of August, about 8 o'clock in the morning, my starboard lookout said, "Big red flare over there." Far over the horizon, not then identifiable, but 2 or 3 days later, we learned about the drop on Hiroshima. It was obvious what it had been. So I'm going to tell my grandchildren my ship saw the flash. Then the second drop was 3 days later, and almost immediately thereafter, the Japanese surrendered.
At Penn State, we had to fall in and march from class to class. When we got there, there was a Marine unit, plus us, and about 3,500 girls. So that was a pretty good ratio. They had to be in at 10 o'clock every night, so if you dated one of the co-eds, you had to make sure to get her home on time. But then the Marines had an incident with one of those co-eds, so they all got shipped out at the end of the first term. That left the 3,500 girls and the Army fellows. That was even better ratio.
We kept in that area until the European War ended. When the European War ended, I had 146 points. That made me one among the first 10 men to go home out of the whole group of 1,000. I'd been in a little longer, and I had a son that I hadn't seen. That gave me 5 points. My son was 1.5 years old when I first saw him.
The war was over by now, but my assignments never stopped because I was assigned to arrest the SS men who were above the rank of sergeant. I was assigned to arrest the Gestapo. We assumed that the Gestapo got to be a bad person, you know. The odds are it was, but how do you prove it and all? The best thing is to pick them up and then let the court decide how bad he was.
On the fourth day of big waves and high winds, a rogue wave hit us. The wave crested as it passed the bow about 45 degrees above me. I was on the bridge when green water crashed into the bridge structure and down the forward smokestack. The splinter shield around our number 1 gun caught the blow and ripped up 30 feet of deck. Green water flooded down into the forward part of the ship. We had to turn tail to the wind and seas, which is an extremely high risk. We heeled over 55 degrees while I was on the low side of the bridge. Fortunately, some waves pushed us back up. We missed our accompanying tanker by about 50 feet. Lucky for us, because the wind created almost zero visibility. We managed to inform the tanker of our problems. The closest land was Bermuda, so we headed there with another destroyer as an escort. We reached Bermuda Christmas morning.
One day the top sergeant was trying to make us tie some ropes to pull like a clothesline so you could put a silhouette of an airplane on it so we could learn with 22s to shoot at the target. As some guys pulled it, you'd pull your clothes, he couldn't get a knot tied small enough to go through the pulleys. It was always hard for me to keep my mouth shut because I knew what I was saying. I said, "Sergeant, why don't you splice it?" He said, "Private, you know how to slice rope?" "Splice rope?" I said, "Yeah, I know how to splice rope," because I'd learned it in the Boy Scouts and I learned it on the farm. God, it was hot down there. Well, while the other boys was doing bayonet practice, I sat in the shade splicing rope. Well, that got me some points, and I was appointed to a special squad as first scout, testing the M1 rifle when they were trying to perfect them.
It was a wonderful experience. I saw a lot of the world, had a lot of fun. The main thing I think anybody who is going into the service, they should go in with the idea that they're going to like it and not dislike it. I had 7 roommates that I lost during the war. That's more, I think, than most people. After about 8 or 10 months in the war, I decided I was not going to try to remember anybody's name again, because if I did, it was going to haunt me the rest of my life. I only tried to remember the names of the fellows I went over with. In our group, during the war, we lost 169 crews of 6 people each.
As I remember, it rained all night the 5th of June. Anyway, the invasion was on. They loaded us on the transport ships, and we set out there in the channel, starting on the 6th. And the Germans would come over and bomb us every morning, just before it got light, and drop flares, which lit up as light as the lightest moonlight. Then we landed on Utah Beach 4 days after the initial invasion.
I don't remember now, but I probably had 6 or 8 stars. Then I got the High Honor Medal of Duty, beyond the call of duty. I was a sergeant when I retired. When we got back, my brother and I found that we were both, at times, pretty close together, but never got to see each other or anything. But he was in some of the same battles that I was in, like crossing the Rhine. I'm actually lucky that I came home. I had had some close ones. Got hit in the head with a bayonet. The medics on the battlefield patched me up.
We were moving, and mostly in the field, always intense. Then we got to Italy. A commanding officer made a reconnaissance by Piper Cub, and he moved us to this beautiful spot beside Lake Bolsena in Italy. He thought that would be a wonderful place for us. So, going in one afternoon by truck, we came to a point in the road where we had to make a left turn. But as we approached, we noticed all of these men in mortars and all laying about in a field. We thought, this doesn't look good, you know. Anyway, we went to our own site that afternoon. Come to find out, we were 10 miles ahead of our own infantry. The enemy was on the other side of the lake, and they'd watched us all afternoon setting up camp and everything. We didn't know it then. Then somebody found out that evening, and they came in around 8 o'clock or so and said, "Be very quiet, but we're moving out of here now. Pick up everything." They said in an hour or so after we left, the Germans shelled the devil out of that place. They said the next morning that it looked like a plowed field. If we'd have stayed, we'd have all been killed.
My longest trip was to Oklahoma. They unloaded the men, and we came right back. They were all soldiers that had been injured. Some were up walking around and doing well. They may have had a dressing to be done or something of that type. But then there were others. There was one young man there that I didn't know if he'd ever make it back to Oklahoma. He was so bad. I've often wondered if he did, but he would have known he was there in Oklahoma anyways, and that would have pleased him. Some of those who could walk, when they got off the ship and got on the wharf, they would just kneel right down and kiss the earth, literally, you know. I'd heard of people doing that, but I'd never seen it before. They were just so glad to be back.
It was just Thanksgiving time in 1943, and I was coming home. There were two other local boys in my company, Raymond Gilson and Newell Wood. We were on the way home. We got to Rutland and really were having a blizzard, and we started to thumb our way to Woodstock. We got up on North Main Street in Rutland, and a photographer came along and asked us to pose with our little ditty bags on our shoulder. He took our picture, and the next day it was on the front page of the Rutland Herald.